is an ho that most people sleep through. Not because they are lazy, not because they lack discipline, but because no one ever told them what that hour actually is. The monks knew, the temple priests knew, the initiates who walked the sacred corridors of Egypt, of Tibet, of Greece. They did not wake before dawn to be productive. They woke before dawn because they had discovered something that has been deliberately protected, hidden inside the traditions of every major civilization that has ever existed on this planet, and systematically forgotten by the modern world. There is a quality of reality that is only available in that hour, a thinning of the veil between what you are on the surface and what you actually are underneath. The ancients did not call it a morning routine. They called it the sacred hour, and what they discovered inside it changed everything. Tonight, we go back, not to a productivity hack, to the original secret, the one that was never meant to be forgotten. There was a young man who had walked the roads of ancient Greece for 3 years. Not as a traveller, as a seeker. He had left everything, his family, his trade, his village, not because he was running from something, but because he had felt something, in a moment so brief and so complete, that it had made everything else feel hollow by comparison. He had been sitting by a well at the edge of his village, just before dawn, before the market opened, before the noise began, before the world assembled itself into the familiar shape of ordinary life. And in that stillness, something had happened. Not a vision, not a voice. Something quieter than both of those. A quality of presence had descended, or perhaps risen. He could not say which direction it came from, only that for a few moments, the boundary between himself and everything around him had become very thin. The well, the stone, the dark sky shifting toward violet, all of it felt intimate, as if the distance between his awareness and the world was not real, as if it had never been real. And then the sun rose, and the market opened, and the moment passed, but the memory of it never did. For 3 years he had been searching for someone who could tell him what had happened, someone who had felt it too, someone who knew what it meant. He had spoken to philosophers in the agora. He had visited oracles and priests and wandering teachers. Everyone had words for it. No one had the thing itself. Until the morning he arrived at the gates of Eleusis. The sanctuary was older than anyone could remember, older than the city of Athens, older than the stories that explained it. It sat in the hills above the sea, its stone walls darkened by centuries of torch smoke and sacred fire. And at its gate, an old man was sitting, not a priest in ceremonial robes, just an old man, sitting in the pre-dawn dark, eyes open, completely still. The young seeker approached him. "Excuse me, I am looking for the teachers of the mysteries." The old man looked at him for a long moment. "You have already found one." He gestured to the stone beside him. "Sit." The young man sat. They sat together in silence for what felt like a long time. The sky began its slow transformation, black to deep blue to violet. The old man spoke without turning his head. "What are you looking for?" The young man thought carefully before answering. "I had an experience. Before dawn, 3 years ago. I have been looking for it ever since." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the young man would spend the rest of his life understanding. "You are not looking for an experience. You are looking for the one who had it." The young man did not understand. Not yet. But something in him went very still. the way a lake goes still when the wind stops. And in that stillness, something familiar returned, just for a moment, just long enough to be recognized. The old man noticed. He turned and looked at the young man for the first time. There it is. He stood slowly. Come. And he led the young man through the gate, into the sanctuary, into the beginning of something that had no end. This is where the teaching of the sacred hour begins. Not with a method, not with an instruction, with a recognition. The recognition that what you are looking for has been looking back at you all along. The ancient mystery schools understood something about the hour before dawn that modern culture has completely lost. They understood that this hour is not empty. It is not simply the absence of daytime activity. It is a specific quality of reality, a specific condition of consciousness that makes certain things possible that are not possible at any other time. They called it the threshold, the liminal hour, the time between worlds. And they built entire spiritual traditions around the art of entering it consciously and receiving what it had to offer, not because they were mystics disconnected from ordinary life, but because they had discovered something empirically through centuries of direct observation and transmission. That the hour before dawn is when the veil between the surface self and the deeper self is at its thinnest, and that what can be contacted in that thinness cannot be contacted anywhere else. The old man's name was Callias. He had been a keeper of the mysteries for 40 years, not a high priest, not a ceremonial figure draped in gold and authority, a keeper, someone whose entire life had been devoted to one thing, helping people find what they had already lost. That first morning at the gate of Eleusis, he did not take the young seeker into the inner sanctuary. He did not reveal the hidden teachings. He did not explain the mysteries. He sat with him until the sun was fully risen. And then he sent him away. Come back tomorrow, before dawn. The young man was confused. I have travelled for 3 years to be here. I know. Come back tomorrow, before dawn. He came back every morning for 7 days. The young seeker arrived at the gate before the sun rose, and every morning Callias was already there, sitting still, eyes open. On the 7th morning, the young man arrived and sat beside him without speaking. They sat together in silence as the sky transformed. And something happened, not dramatic, not sudden, a gradual deepening, like water finding its level. The noise in his mind, the constant movement of thought and memory and anticipation, slowed. Not because he tried to slow it, because something in the quality of the hour itself created the conditions for stillness, the way a deep forest creates conditions for silence, not by removing sound, but by absorbing it. He sat there and felt something he had not felt since that morning, by the well 3 years ago. That quality of presence, that thinning of the boundary, that intimacy with everything around him, that felt less like a feeling and more like a remembering. Callias spoke softly beside him. Now you understand the first teaching. The young man did not take his eyes off the horizon. What is the teaching? You cannot find this. You can only stop preventing it. This is the first secret of the sacred hour, and it is the secret that the modern world has completely inverted. The modern world says, use this hour to do more, to build more, to achieve more, to optimize more. And so people set their alarms and reach immediately for their phones, and fill the sacred hour with the same noise. That fills every other hour of their day. And the threshold never opens. Because the threshold does not open for effort. It opens for stillness. Not the stillness of sleep. Not the stillness of unconsciousness. The active stillness of someone who is fully present and fully receptive and not reaching for anything. The ancient traditions all understood this. The Benedictine monks who rose for vigils in the darkest hours of the night were not rising to be productive. They were rising to be present at the threshold, at the hour when the ordinary defences of the mind were still low enough that something deeper could be contacted. The Sufi masters who practiced tahajjud, the voluntary prayer in the dark hours before dawn, were not performing a religious obligation. They were positioning themselves at the exact moment, when the distance between the ordinary self and the divine was at its smallest. The Egyptian priests who rose before the sun and stood in the inner sanctuaries of the temples, facing east, before the first light touched the horizon, were not following a ritual for its own sake. They were attending an appointment with something that only came at that hour, and only came to those who were still enough to receive it. Callias continued his teaching on the 8th morning. He asked the young seeker a question. When you had your experience by the well, what were you doing? Nothing. I was just sitting. Were you trying to have the experience? No, I was not thinking about anything in particular. Callias nodded slowly. And in the 3 years since, when you were searching for it, when you were travelling and asking and seeking, did it come? No. And now, sitting here for 7 mornings, not searching, not trying, just sitting at the threshold. Has something returned? The young man was quiet for a long moment. Yes. Callias looked at him. This is what the mysteries teach. Not how to find what you are looking for. How to stop running from what has never stopped following you. The sacred hour is not the time for effort. It is the time for recognition. And recognition cannot be forced. It can only be allowed. The young man sat with this for a long time. And as the sun rose fully above the horizon, he felt something settle in him. Something that had been restless for 3 years finally went still. Not because he had found the answer, but because he had stopped needing to. Callias did not teach the way most teachers teach. He did not lecture. He did not explain. He did not hand the young seeker a system of beliefs to adopt, or a set of practices to perform, or a philosophy to defend. He pointed, the way you point at the moon, not so that someone will stare at your finger, but so that they will look at what the finger is indicating. On the 9th morning, Callias arrived at the gate carrying something, a small oil lamp, already lit. He sat beside the young man and placed the lamp between them on the stone. They watched the flame together as the sky began its transformation. After a long silence, Callias spoke. Tell me what you see. The young man looked at the flame. A flame, light, heat. Callias shook his head slightly. Look again. The young man looked more carefully. The flame moves. It changes shape constantly. Every moment it is different from the moment before. Yes, and yet, it is still a flame. Something continuous underneath the movement. Callias was quiet for a moment. Now look at your thoughts. The young man closed his eyes. His thoughts moved the way the flame moved, constantly shifting, changing shape, one thought becoming another. becoming an endless movement of mental activity. And yet something was watching all of it, something that was not itself a thought, something continuous underneath the movement. He opened his eyes. Callias was looking at him. The flame is your mind. The young man nodded slowly. And the light it gives, that is your consciousness. But what feeds the flame? What allows it to burn at all? That is what you actually are. This is the second teaching of the sacred hour. And it is the teaching that the greatest traditions of the ancient world spent thousands of years attempting to transmit. In the Egyptian mystery schools, the initiates were taught about the multiple bodies of the human being, the physical body, the energy body, the soul, and at the deepest level, the Ak, the immortal divine self, the aspect of the human being that was not a product of birth and would not end at death, the aspect that existed before this body was born and would continue long after it returned to dust. The entire Egyptian initiatic tradition was oriented toward one single goal: helping the initiate recognize the Ak, not as a concept, not as a belief, as a direct experience, as something so undeniably present that it could never again be doubted. The Hermetic tradition called it the nous, the divine mind, the spark of universal intelligence that animates every human being, and that is itself not individual, but universal, not yours, not mine, the same awareness, looking out through different eyes. The Vedic tradition of ancient India called it Atman, the self beneath the self, the awareness that is aware of awareness, that cannot be found by looking outward, because it is the very thing that is doing the looking. All of these traditions, across thousands of miles and thousands of years, were pointing at the same thing, the same flame, the same light, the same source. And all of them agreed on something else, something that is directly relevant to the sacred hour. This recognition, this direct encounter with what you actually are beneath the surface, is most available at the threshold, in the hour before dawn, when the ordinary mind is still quiet enough that the deeper reality can be perceived, not because it is more present at that hour, it is always equally present, but because the noise is lower, and when the noise is lower, the signal can be heard. Callias continued the teaching that morning. He told the young seeker about the practice that initiates had used for thousands of years to enter the threshold consciously. The practice was simple, almost absurdly simple, which is why most people dismiss it. You wait before the sun rises. You do not reach for anything. You sit in the dark, or you stand at a window, or you walk slowly in the open air. And you do one thing. You notice the awareness that is already present. Not the thoughts, not the feelings, not the plans for the day. The awareness underneath all of that. The one that was here before you decided to wake up. The one that is present before the first thought arises. You rest there, not trying to hold it, not trying to expand it, not trying to make it into anything. Just noticing that it is here, that it has always been here, that it does not arrive with consciousness in the morning and depart when you fall asleep at night. It is simply always present, unchanged by everything that passes through it, the way the sky is unchanged by the clouds that move through it. The young seeker listened to all of this, and then he asked the question that had been forming in him since the first morning. How long does it take? Callias looked at him for a moment. How long does it take for what to recognize it fully, without any doubt? Callias was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You already have." The young man started to protest, but Callias raised a hand. The experience by the well when you were young, the moment at the gate on the first morning, the stillness that returns each dawn when you stop reaching. What do you think those were? The young man had no answer. Recognition does not happen once, Callias said quietly. It deepens every morning at the threshold. It deepens until one day you realize it has never not been there. And that is when everything changes. 3 months passed. Every morning before dawn, the young seeker arrived at the gate of Eleusis. Every morning, Callias was already there, and every morning, they sat together at the threshold, not always in silence. Sometimes Callias spoke. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he told stories of initiates who had come before, seekers from every corner of the ancient world, who had arrived at the same gate, with the same hunger and the same confusion, and had left carrying something they could not name, but could never forget. But most mornings, they simply sat and watched the sky change and let the threshold do what the threshold does when you stop interfering with it. The young seeker began to notice something, not in the mornings at the sanctuary, in the rest of his life. The quality that arrived in the sacred hour had begun to bleed into other hours, not always, not completely, but in moments. A conversation that suddenly became strangely clear, a decision that arrived fully formed, without the usual noise of deliberation. A moment walking through the marketplace, when the boundary between himself and everything around him thinned again, without warning, without effort, without the pre-dawn darkness or the stone gate or the old teacher beside him. Just there. He mentioned this to Callias one morning. The old teacher nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for exactly this. This is the third teaching. The young seeker waited. The sacred hour is not a container. It is a door, and a door, once opened, does not need to be opened again each time. It simply stays open, a little wider with each passing. The ancient traditions understood this progression intimately. They did not teach the sacred hour as an isolated practice, as something you did in the morning and then left behind. When the ordinary day began, they taught it as the beginning of a different relationship with reality, a relationship in which the awareness that is contacted at the threshold gradually becomes the ground from which ordinary life is lived. Not a special state achieved in meditation, not a peak experience to be chased and remembered. The actual texture of daily experience transformed, not because the world changes, but because the one perceiving it has remembered something fundamental about what they are. The Hermetic tradition called this the great work, not the accumulation of external knowledge or power. The progressive recognition of the divine nature of consciousness itself. The realization that what you are, at the deepest level, is not separate from the intelligence that moves the stars, and grows the forests, and beats the heart without being asked. The same intelligence, the same awareness, the same flame. As above, so below. The ancient Hermetic principle, the law that governs both the movement of galaxies and the movement of thoughts, the structure of the cosmos and the structure of consciousness. They are not separate systems operating by different rules. They are the same system, appearing at different scales and to know one is to know the other. This is why the inscription above the temple at Delphi read, "Know thyself," not as a platitude, not as a piece of philosophical advice, as the central instruction of an entire civilization's highest wisdom. Know what you actually are, not the name, not the story, not the accumulation of memory and role and identity. What you are before all of that. What you were before you were given a name. What remains when everything temporary is set aside. Know that, and everything else follows. On the morning that marked 3 months since his arrival, Callias arrived at the gate carrying something different. Not the oil lamp. A small piece of stone, carved with a single symbol. He placed it in the young seeker's hands. The young man looked at it. A flame. Simple. Ancient. Precise. He looked up at Callias. What is this? A reminder. A reminder of what? Callias looked at him steadily. That what you are looking for is what is looking. The young man held the stone in his hands and felt something he had not felt since the morning by the well. 3 years and a lifetime ago, not the thinning of the boundary, the recognition that the boundary had never existed, that the distance between himself and everything around him, between his awareness and the awareness that moved through all things, was a story, a convincing story, a story so old and so familiar that it had mistaken itself for reality, but a story nonetheless. He sat with the stone in his hands as the sky moved from black to deep blue, from deep blue to violet, from violet to the first impossible gold of the horizon, and something that had been searching for 3 years finally stopped. Not because it had found what it was looking for, but because it had recognized that it had never been lost. There is something I have not told you yet. Something that Callias told the young seeker on the morning after his recognition. Something that most teachers of the ancient traditions left for last, because it requires everything that came before it to be truly heard. The young man arrived at the gate the following morning, lighter than he had ever felt, as if something heavy had been set down, that he had been carrying so long. He had forgotten it was there. He sat beside Callias in the pre-dawn dark and waited. Callias did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than usual. There is one more thing you need to understand. The young man listened. What you recognized yesterday will be forgotten. The young man felt something contract in him. Callias continued, not permanently, not completely, but the ordinary mind will reassert itself. The noise will return. The boundary will seem real again. The story will resume. This is not failure. This is the nature of the human condition. He paused. And this is precisely why the sacred hour exists, not to give you the recognition once, but to return you to it. Every morning, before the story has fully assembled itself again, before the accumulated weight of identity and worry and role has settled back into place, the threshold is the gap between the sleeping self and the waking self, between who you were in the dream and who you will be in the day. In that gap, the story has not yet started, and in the silence before the story starts, the truth is simply there, unobstructed. The young man sat with this. I will forget. Yes, and I will remember again. Every morning, Callias looked at him. Every morning. This is the practice, not a practice you do for 90 days and then graduate from, a practice you return to for the rest of your life. Not because you are broken, not because the recognition is fragile, but because you are human. And being human means living inside a story that is always trying to convince you that it is the whole truth. The sacred hour is your daily return to the reality beneath the story, not an escape from ordinary life, a remembering that ordinary life is happening inside something vastly larger than ordinary life. The Zen tradition has a teaching that speaks to this directly. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities do not change. The one performing them has remembered something, and that remembering changes everything about the quality of the activity. Not its content, its texture. The wood is the same wood, the water is the same water, but the one carrying the water is no longer carrying the story, that the water is separate from them. This is what the sacred hour cultivates, not a special state, not a permanent altered condition, a quality of remembering that becomes more available, more natural, more effortless. With each morning at the threshold, the young seeker understood something in that moment that he had not understood the day before. The recognition was not the destination. The threshold was not a gate to pass through once and leave behind. It was a relationship, a living, breathing, daily relationship with the deepest truth of what he was. And like all living relationships, it required showing up, not perfectly, not heroically, just consistently, every morning, before the sun rose, before the story began, in the gap, in the stillness, in the sacred hour. He looked down at the carved stone in his hand, the flame symbol catching the first grey light of the approaching dawn. Kalia spoke one final time that morning. You came here looking for an experience. Yes, you found something better. What a direction. The young man looked at him. Every morning you return to the threshold. You take one more step in that direction, not towards something distant, towards something that is already here, already present, already burning. He gestured toward the horizon, where the first impossible suggestion of gold was beginning to separate itself from the darkness. The flame does not need to be lit. It only needs to be recognized, and the sacred hour is when recognition is most possible. The young man held the stone and felt the flame, not in his hands, behind his eyes, in the awareness that was watching the horizon change, in the presence that had been here all along, waiting, not impatiently, the way dawn waits, knowing that the light will come, because the light always comes. If you are still here with me, if you have walked with the young seeker through the gate of Eleusis, sat beside Callias in the pre-dawn dark, and felt something stir in you that you cannot quite name, I want to pause for just a moment, not to interrupt what we are building together, but to say something directly. This channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation, not surface wisdom, not motivation that fades by Tuesday. The kind of transmission that the ancient traditions spent thousands of years protecting because they knew its value, because they knew what it could do to a human being who was ready to receive it, if that is what you are here for. Subscribe to Sacred Flame, because what we are uncovering together, video by video, layer by layer, goes deeper than any single conversation can contain. And I want you present for what comes next. Now, back to the threshold, because there is one more thing Callias taught that I have saved for this moment, something he told the young seeker. on the last morning before he entered the inner sanctuary, before the formal initiation began. He said, "The greatest obstacle to the sacred hour is not laziness. It is not the comfort of the warm bed. It is not the resistance of the tired body. The greatest obstacle is the belief that you already know what you will find there." The young man did not understand at first. Callias continued, "Every morning you arrive at the threshold. You must arrive as if for the first time, not carrying yesterday's experience, not expecting a repetition of last week's recognition, not measuring this morning against any other morning, empty, open, without agenda, because the threshold responds to openness, and openness cannot coexist with expectation. This is the teaching that separates those who practice the sacred hour from those who truly enter it. Many people can wake before dawn. Many people can sit in silence. Many people can follow the outer form of the practice perfectly and still never cross the threshold because they arrive full of what they think they know, full of what they hope to feel, full of the accumulated conclusions of every previous morning, and the threshold, which opens only for what is empty enough to receive, remains closed. The ancient initiates understood this. It is why the preparation for initiation at Eleusis involved days of fasting, not primarily for physical purification, for the purification of expectation, to arrive at the threshold empty enough that something real could enter, empty of conclusions, empty of certainty, empty of the comfortable story, that you already know what reality is and what you are and what is possible, because the sacred hour does not confirm what you already know. It reveals what you have not yet been able to see, and revelation, by definition, can only arrive where there is space for it. The young seeker heard this teaching and felt something uncomfortable move through him because he recognized it. In the first weeks at the threshold, he had arrived open, genuinely not knowing what to expect, and the threshold had opened. But gradually, as the mornings accumulated, he had begun to arrive with expectations, memories of previous mornings, hopes for particular experiences, subtle preferences about what the stillness should feel like, and without fully realizing it, he had begun arriving full, and the depth of the threshold had subtly, imperceptibly decreased. Callias had seen it. Of course he had, and now he was giving the young seeker the most important correction of the entire 3 months. Not a new technique, not a deeper philosophy, a reminder: come empty every morning, as if you have never sat at this threshold before, as if you do not know what will happen, as if you are genuinely, for the first time, a seeker, because you are. Every single morning, you are a seeker again. The recognition of yesterday does not exempt you from the openness of today. Nothing does. This is not a burden. It is the gift, because it means that the sacred hour can never become routine, can never become mechanical, can never become just another thing you do before the day begins. If you arrive empty, it is always new, always alive, always capable of revealing something that yesterday's version of you could not have received. The young man understood, and the following morning, he arrived at the gate of Eleusis for what felt like the very first time, empty, open, without agenda, and the threshold opened wider than it ever had before. Years passed. The young seeker became something he had no name for. Not a priest, not a philosopher, not a teacher in any formal sense, something quieter than all of those, someone who had found a direction and kept walking in it every morning before dawn. He arrived at the threshold, not always at the gate of Eleusis, not always beside Callias. The threshold is not a place. He had learned that. It is a quality of attention, a quality of presence, available anywhere, to anyone who arrives empty enough to receive it. He sat at thresholds in harbours and hilltops, in olive groves and stone courtyards, in the silence before sleeping cities, and the darkness before waking ones. And every morning, the same thing happened. The sky moved from black to deep blue, from deep blue to violet, from violet to the first impossible gold. And something in him that had no name recognized something in that movement that also had no name. And in that recognition, everything was enough. Not because his life had become easy, it had not. Not because he had found answers to all his questions. He had not. But because something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between himself and his experience. He was no longer fighting the river. He was no longer standing on the bank, wishing the water moved differently. He was in the river, moving with it, part of it, made of the same water, going to the same sea. Callias died in the winter of the young man's 5th year at Eleusis, peacefully before dawn, sitting at the gate as he had sat every morning for 40 years. The young man found him there when he arrived for the sacred hour, still, eyes open, facing east, where the light would come. He sat beside him for a long time and did not feel what he expected to feel. He felt something vast and quiet, something that had room for grief and gratitude and wonder, all at once, without any of them cancelling the others. He understood then what Callias had been teaching him from the very first morning. Not a technique, not a philosophy, not even a practice, a way of being present with whatever is, without armour, without resistance, without the constant effort of trying to make experience into something other than what it is. The sacred hour had not given him this. It had created the conditions in which he could find it himself. The way fertile ground does not create the seed, it simply gives it somewhere to grow. And now I want to leave you with something, not an instruction, not a system, not a morning routine dressed in ancient clothing, something quieter than all of that. Tomorrow morning, before the alarm has fully pulled you back into the ordinary, before the day has assembled itself, before the story is resumed, give yourself one moment, just one, in the gap, in the stillness before the first thought, in the dark before the light, and notice not what you are thinking, not what you need to do, not what yesterday meant or what tomorrow requires, just that you are aware that something is present before you decided to be present, that the flame is already burning before you remember to look for it. You do not need to be in Eleusis for this. You do not need a stone gate or an ancient teacher or years of initiatic preparation. You need only one moment of genuine stillness, one moment of arriving empty, one moment of noticing that the awareness looking out through your eyes right now has been here all along, unchanged by everything that has passed through it, undiminished by everything the world has added to you, present, burning, quietly, inexhaustibly, the same flame that burned in the temples of Egypt and the sanctuaries of Greece and the monasteries of Tibet burns in you right now, in this moment. It does not need to be lit. It only needs to be recognized. And the sacred hour, every morning, before the world begins, is your invitation to that recognition. Not once, not until you get it right, every morning, for the rest of your life, arriving empty, arriving open, arriving at the threshold, as if for the first time, because it always is. If something moved in you tonight, share this with 5 people, because somewhere in your life, there is someone who wakes before dawn with a chest full of something they cannot explain and has never been told. That what they are feeling is not confusion. It is contact. Give them this and leave a comment below. Something real. Tell me what happened in you as you listened. What stirred, what recognized, what remembered. And if there is a question living in you, something you have carried for years, leave it there, because that question might be the next fire we light. Together, subscribe to Sacred Flame. The threshold is always open, and we are only just beginning.